Hi, so in this video we're going to look at how to create a CLI, a command line interface, using the Python click library. Hi, so in this video we're going to take a look at how to create a CLI, a command line interface, using the click library in Python. As usual, the code for this project is available in the GitHub repo, which is linked below the video. So we could definitely use ArcParse, and certainly for creating very simple CLI tools in Python, ArcParse, which is part of the standard library, can work for that. But if you've worked with ArcParse before, or you've seen the video that I have on ArcParse in my Python course, the deep dive course, you'll know that using ArcParse can be a lot of hard work and can get quite tedious, especially if you want to create more complicated kind of CLIs. And this is where Click really shines, because it makes creating CLIs very easy. And it has a lot of options as well. So the documentation for the Click library can be located at this link here that I have in the README file, which is the file we're looking at right now, which is in the repo. And basically it is this website, and it has all the documentation for the Click library. You'll most likely be spending a lot of your time in the documentation section, which has a lot of detailed documentation about every single aspect of the Click library. And as you can see, it's quite a complex library. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of functionality. I'm definitely not going to be able to touch upon, a vast majority of that functionality, but at least we'll get started and we'll do some pretty sophisticated things using a Python CLI. And you'll see how much simpler it is than using ArcParse. All right, so to get started, we'll have to install, of course, the Click library in our virtual environment. We're also going to need a couple more libraries. We're going to need setup tools, and I'm also going to use tabulate. And then optionally, you can also install isort and black if you want to basically reformat your code. And I have a video on isort and black on this YouTube channel. So this video is about Click, not about creating the Python code that's going to do stuff. So I'm going to start with this project. It's all in the repo. And let me show you what we have at this point. There is no CLI at this point in this project. It's just a regular Python project. So I have a pip file or a requirements.txt file, same thing, depending on what you use for your virtual environment. As you can see, we've got Click, setup tools, tabulate, isort, and black. For isort and black, you can run that manually, or you can use the make file that I've included as well. There is also a configuration for black and isort, that's in PyProject TOML file. And then we have our actual Python code. So we have main, which as you can see is currently empty, it doesn't do anything. We have a CSV viewer file, which basically only has this preview_CSV. And it's basically a function, a regular Python function that's going to take a file and it's going to take some arguments and it's going to display that file. So we'll get into exactly what the CLI needs to do, but this is just the base project. So we've got something to preview CSV files. We have something to preview JSON files. I have an enums, which if you look at the tabulate video that I have in the same YouTube channel, which is what we can use for tabulating data, then these are the table formats. I just chose to put them into an enum. And then we have this CSV converter, which basically is a function that will allow us to convert from CSV to JSON. So we'll talk about these functions throughout this video, but I'm not going to dwell on what this code actually does. You can go ahead and read it. It's properly documented as well. Okay, so let's close this, but let's go back. Actually, let me leave it open. Let's go back to the CSV viewer. And you'll notice that VS Code is telling me that it doesn't know what tabulate is. Now I know that I've installed tabulate in my virtual environment. The thing is that VS Code doesn't know about this environment. So I'm going to have to tell it here. Right now, this is what it's set to. It's using my default here of user local bin Python 3.10. Obviously, I want to use my virtual environment. Where's Python located for my virtual environment? Basically, it's located in my virtual environment's bin directory. So if I do an ls here, you'll see that I've got Python right here. So that is the version of Python that I need to specify here, right? So I can get my current path, which is this one over here. And then I'm just going to go in here So I need to enter this interpreter path. I'm just going to copy that here and then also add on Python. And then I'm going to hit enter. You can see that now it's changed. It's telling me it's looking at that venv over here. And you can see that now it knows what tabulate is. So everything's well set up now. So let's close this. And let's go ahead and start actually creating a CLI, a simple CLI. So we're going to put our code in main.py, which is empty at this point. And we want to start with a very basic example that's going to have two commands, a time and a date command that should print out the current time and date in UTC. So let's go ahead and implement that. So from date time, I'm going to import date time. And then I'm also going to import click. So these are the two libraries that I need, the two modules that I need to import. So now I'm going to create two functions. One is going to be called date, and it's going to basically print, I'm going to take the date time, then I'm going to do UTC now, and then I'm going to take just the date, and then we'll do the ISO format. Okay, so that's all that does, and then we'll do the same thing with time. So let's go ahead and put that here, and we'll call this time, and then I'm going to call the same UTC now, but then I'm going to get just the time out of it, and again I'm going to ISO format it. And that's our Python application. There is no command line here. So now it's time to add in our CLI. Now for the CLI, the way Click works is that you create groups of commands, and then you add commands to each groups, and groups can be nested. And so essentially you start with a top level group, and then everything is going to go below that. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to create something called def main CLI, and I'm leaving that in the main file. That's fine. We'll see later that we probably want to do something different when we're looking at larger projects and more complicated CLIs. So I'm going to create this function called main CLI, and it is going to do absolutely nothing. It doesn't need to actually do anything. It is just a function that is going to become the entry point for the CLI. Now, how do we do that? Well, we're going to have to create a group. And so this is our main CLI group. This is our root group. So all we need to do is use the click group decorator. And this now has become basically a group for our command line interface. Now we need to kick off the command line. So we're going to do this. If name equals main. So if we're going to run the main module directly from the command line, then we want to do the following. We want to call main CLI. And that's it. So at this point, the CLI, when we run main.py, the CLI is going to be initialized. It's going to be kicked off, and that's going to take over. Let's see what I mean by that. Let's go ahead and just run Python main.py. And you can see that it gives us some information. It tells us that this is the usage. We've got options, command, arguments. There's options for help, but really very little else. Now, if we hadn't put this in here, right? If I take that out and if I rerun, then there's actually zero output. So you can see that calling this main CLI did something. At this point, not much. So let's go ahead now and add commands to our CLI, because that's what's missing. It doesn't have any commands. We created a group, but we need to add commands to the CLI. So let's go ahead and do that, and it's very simple. We go here and we decorate this date function, and we say click dot command. So we're saying this is a command, and we're going to do the same thing here. We're going to say add click command. And now we have two commands. But of course, Click doesn't know what to do with those commands. It knows that they're commands, but it doesn't know where to place them in our CLI. Remember that I was telling you the CLI is basically a group of commands, and those commands can either be direct commands or they can be other groups. So you can nest groups within groups. So our main group doesn't actually have any commands. So what we need to do is we actually need to add those commands to that main group. How do we do that? Well, the main group's name in Python is main CLI, because that was the name of the function. So we're going to say main underscore CLI dot add command, and we're going to add the command date. And now the name of the command is again just the function name. And then we're going to do the same thing with time. So we're going to take this and we're going to duplicate it and just change that to time, like so. So now if we run this and we do the same thing but as before, python main.py, and let me clear, you'll see that now we've got a little bit more. We've got commands, date and time. So we have those two things, right? It knows now we're starting to build our CLI up. And of course, I can now call the date and time commands. I can say python main.py date, for example. And as you can see, it printed out the date. And we can do the same thing with time. Same thing, right? So you can see that we have the start of this CLI. Now, one thing I want to change very quickly is this print. We can certainly use print, but click also provides an echo command, which is a little bit more robust than print. So if your terminal isn't properly set up, depending on your circumstances, you can also use coloring optionally. If you look at the documentation for click, you'll see information about that. So it's better in general to say click.echo instead. It really doesn't change what's happening in terms of what we're going to use today. So if we go ahead and run this again, you'll see that nothing changes, right? It's the same as before. Now let's go ahead and add another command. So we're going to add in another command, and this is going to be called def view click docs. So this is going to be a way for me to basically open up the Click website, the documentation, in my browser. And Click actually provides a very simple command to do that. It's called click.launch. So we can go ahead and say click.launch, and we're going to launch this website. I'm just going to copy paste that from the notebook, or from the code. And what I'm going to do as well is I'm going to add a doc string to this function. So triple double quotes, we're going to generate the doc string, and it's going to be open clicks documentation. So now let's switch to the terminal, and let's see what happens when I type python main.py. You'll see that again I have date and time, but I do not have view click docs. How come? Well, I didn't add that as a command to my group. I need to do that. So I'm going to copy paste this above the group. I just like to keep them organized that way. I need to first make it into a command. That's the first step. And then I need to add it to the group. So now I'm going to say main underscore CLI dot add command, and I'm going to add command view click docs, like so. Okay, so now let's go ahead and look at our command line again. Let's run it. And you can see that I now have view click docs, and I also have the doc string that I gave. Now it shows the doc string. In fact, it only shows the first line of the doc string. You can add more information here. So let's say more information here. And so what happens is that I now have a CLI. I have a view click docs. Okay, I can do help on that as well. And when I do that, you can see that I now get in, documentation specifically for the view click docs. And in particular, I get the full docs that are specified here. Okay, so that's one thing. The other thing is I really don't like what this command looks like, right? Main.py, it's called view click docs. I'd rather just call it maybe click docs or view docs or just docs, right? Whatever it is. So I could certainly change the function name in Python, but that's not what I want to do. What I really want to do is leave that as is, because I kind of like having that when I'm looking at this over here. I like the full name, but that's not necessarily the name that I want for the CLI. Well, that's very easy to do. The command decorator can actually take arguments, one of which is called name. And that's going to name it however we want. So I might call it click docs instead, like so. And I've got to put that in quotes. So now if we look at the CLI again, you'll see that it is called click docs now. And I can go ahead and run it, Python, and then we can say click docs. And that's going to open up the browser here. And it opened up on my other monitor. You can't see it, but when you test that on yours, it will actually open up the link that we provided here in your default browser. Okay, so at this point, we've done a few things. We have set up the start of our CLI, and we've seen some examples of how to use it. What I do not like is having to type python main.py every time, because that's going to become tedious. And if you have used CLIs before, you know that you typically don't do that. So what we need to do is we need to essentially package up our CLI and then install it. And for that, we're going to use another library called Setup Tools. I'm not going to get into the details of Setup Tools. There is a link that I have in the README that you can click on if you want to have more information. I'm really just going to show you here how we use it to install and set up our CLI. So of course, you'll have to install Setup Tools in your virtual environment if you haven't done so already. And then we're going to need to create a setup.py file. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's create a new file, setup.py. And what we're going to do in here, and I'm just going to paste that from the repo, but what we do here is we basically define what this package is. So one of the things that's kind of, everything's important here. One of the things is the name of the package, right? Like tabulate or setup tools or click. These are the package names, right? So this is going to be the name of the package. I'm going to call it my super duper CLI. I can give it a version number. I can tell it what the main modules are, the top level modules. In this case, I only have one. And then I can also tell it that the install requires click. It actually requires tabulate as well. So technically, I should probably put tabulate in here as well, and any other libraries that this CLI is going to require. It doesn't require isort and black, right? Isort and black that I have here, I need just when I'm doing development, not for running the CLI. And then this is the really critical point. This entry points. This entry points, and these are for console scripts. So this is a dictionary, and the key here is console scripts. And here is the string that says we have a script that's going to be called CLI. That's the name of the CLI that we're going to use on the command line. I could call that whatever I wanted. You can call it whatever name you want, right? It just has to be a variable name. It has to be something you can type on the command line. And then you tell it, what is it going to do? Well, it's going to basically use the main_CLI function in the main module. So if we go back to the main module, remember we had this main CLI. So now we don't need to call it this way anymore. So we're just going to delete that altogether. We don't need that anymore because we have this entry point defined as main_CLI. Okay, so the important things to remember, this name is just your package name. This name is how you're going to invoke the CLI on the command line. You can make that whatever you want, but that's what you'll have to type. So instead of typing python main.py, I'm just going to type CLI. That's it, nothing else. No Python prefix, nothing like that. And then the commands, CLI date, CLI time, like we had before. Okay, so that defines the setup.py, but now we need to actually install it. So once we have that, we're going to go ahead and install, we're going to basically pip install package that I have over here that's been defined by setup.py. And one of the things that I'm going to do as well is I'm going to make it editable. Now this is really important because what happens when you install this package over here, it's going to install it, and then the files that it used, like the main file, for example, that it used, and the other Python files, if you make changes to them here, when you run your CLI again that was installed, it will not see those changes. It's like an independent copy, right, of all the code that goes into this CLI package, right, my super duper CLI. It's kind of self-contained. When you use this dash dash editable, it actually kind of links the things together so that if I make changes in my code here, it will be immediately reflected in my CLI installation. And this is very useful when you're developing. Now, when you distribute your CLI, you don't need that editable. You just do pip install, and then you'd pip install wherever you would pip install whatever folder contains setup.py. It's going to look for that by default. So in my case, I'm going to pip install it from where I am right now. So from the root, right? This is where I am. I've got my setup.py here. So I'm going to pip install. The only difference is I'm going to make it editable, and then I'm going to install the current directory, and it's going to find that setup.py. So when I run this, you can see that it said successfully installed my super duper CLI version 0.1.0. And now, instead of typing python main.py like I did before, and remember we took that code out completely, now I can just type CLI. And you can see it's the same output as before, right? It tells me what the commands are. So I can say CLI time, gives me that, and so on. So this is a very straightforward CLI that we've written. And you can see how simple it was, right? We just had to basically decorate some functions in Python. And we've got our CLI done. Now, obviously, there's a lot more that we're going to add to this. So what's next? Well, now we want to write a proper CLI. And we're going to use the code that basically I have already, the CSV Converter, the CSV Viewer, the JSON Viewer. Here's what we want our CLI to be able to do. We want a CSV Previewer that's going to allow us to preview all the lines in a CSV file or just the first n rows. We want the CSV to be nicely formatted, and we're going to use the Tabulate library for that. Go check my video on Tabulate if you haven't seen it already, or if you don't know that library. Then we're also going to have a JSON previewer that's also going to basically properly format JSON, and then will allow us to either view the entire file or view the first n lines of the JSON. Obviously, JSON is not like CSV, but it's still formatted in lines, right? If we put in the carriage returns and the tabs for the indentations and so on, we can certainly read a certain number of lines from that JSON object. So that's what we'll do here. And then we also want a converter that's going to convert a CSV file to a JSON representation. And then we'll have options for whether the CSV file contains a header row or not. We'll have the option to specify the column headers if we want to override what's in the CSV file, for example, or if the CSV file doesn't have header row. For simplicity, though, we're going to assume that the data types in the CSV file are all strings, right? So we're going to kind of ignore data types in the CSV, because this video is about click, not about transforming CSV to JSON. Okay, so you'll need to install the Tabulate library if you haven't done so already. And we're going to split the code, right? So this step 2 was splitting the code. It's already done here, so I'm not going to talk about it more. And we're going to start now by creating 2 command groups in our CLI. I want a viewers command group and a converters command group. So viewers and converters are not commands, they're command groups. So that means that, for example, under the viewers group, I will have 2 commands, one to do CSV views and one to view JSON. So the CLI would be invoked this way: CLI viewers CSV or CLI viewers JSON. And then we would have to provide the file name and then whatever other options we're going to want to accept. For converters, it'll be the same, except we only have a single converter. So here I'm going to say CLI converters, and then the actual command is going to be CSV. So that's what I mean by groups. And they're all grouped under our main CLI, right? Which is named CLI. But remember that from the setup tools, CLI is actually basically pointing to main_CLI, which was this here, right? This entity, click group. So that's what we're going to do. And where are we going to do that? I don't want to put it in the main.py file. I could start adding things in here, but now main.py just has all this stuff. And as you get more and more complicated command lines, you really want to break your code up into sections, into modules and files, right? That makes sense. Not put everything into one single giant mess. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to build up the CLI commands for viewers in the viewers module. And I'm going to build up the CLI commands for the converters in the converters module, right? In those packages, not in main. Where am I going to do it? Well, for viewers, I'm going to show you there's different ways, right? You could put it in any file in here. It doesn't actually matter, but I like to kind of organize things a little bit differently. So one is for converters, I'm actually going to create a new file that I'm going to call CLI.py. And I'm going to reserve this file for actually just implementing the CLI. Because remember, this CSV converter has got nothing to do with the command line interface. This is just Python code that I may be using somewhere else in my application. I just want to now provide a CLI that's going to give me access to this function from the command line. That's all I'm doing. So I'm adding functionality, right? So I'm going to do it in this file over here. Now for viewers, on the other hand, I'm going to do it differently. Viewers is a package. It's a namespace package with 3 submodules. I'm going to create another file in here, but this one is going to be the init. So I'm going to use the init. So this is now a regular Python package, and I'm going to put the CLI code in the init instead. So just to show you that we have, different approaches that we can take. So let's go ahead and start with the converters. So for the converters, remember right now I'm just going to create the groups. So I'm going in here and I'm going to import click. I need that, and I need to create a group, def converter group. That's going to be my function. You saw how we created that main group. Well, we're going to do exactly the same thing here. The difference is I'm not going to pass, I'm going to put in a doc string. Remember, the doc string is what actually shows up in the help of our CLI. So I'm going to call this converter commands, right? And I could add additional info here, something like that. Okay, but this of course is not a group yet. We need to decorate it. So we're going to say click.group. And that's it. Our group has been created. Now let's go ahead and do the same thing for the viewers group. So I'm just going to really copy paste this code. But this time I'm going to put it in the init. So in the init, again, I'm going to have to import click. I'm going to have to create a group. Now this one I'm going to call the viewers group. And this is the file viewers, let's say. And again, you can just, make that whatever you want. Okay, so let's see what our command line looks like at this point now. So I'm going to do CLI, and you can see that I have click docs, date and time. I don't have the viewers and I don't have the converters. Why not? Because I haven't added the group, right? Those groups to the main CLI group. We added those commands, time, date, and click docs to the main group. We did that in main over here. We did that in, if I can find it, in this code over here. But we haven't added our new groups, and we need to do that. So the first thing is I'm going to import them here. So let me close this down so we can see more of the code. And I'm going to say from converters import CLI, or I could even say from converters.cli import converter group, right? I could do that. And I could say from viewers. Now I use the dunder init here, so I can just basically get it from the viewers package, the viewers module directly. I can say import, and then here it's going to be the viewers group. Okay. And I would like to keep this consistent, converter group, viewers group. So I'm going to go back to the converters and the CLI, and I'm going to call this converters group, just to keep it consistent. So if we go back, I'll have to change that to converters group. Okay, we've imported it, but now we still need to add them to our main CLI. Well, that's very simple. I'm going to say main CLI add command, and then it's going to be the converters group. And we're going to also add the viewers group, like so. Okay, so now we've added those groups. Let's see what our CLI looks like at this point. So if I say CLI, you'll notice that now I have the converters group and I have the viewers group. Now, of course, those don't have any commands, right? If I say CLI viewers dash group, okay, I just get nothing. It just gives me some information about, the help info for that, but there's no commands. The other thing too is I don't like viewers group. I want to say CLI viewers, like so, right? I want to do that. I don't want to have to type group. So for that, remember, we have this name. We have that for the command. We also have it for the group. So if we go back to group, we can go ahead here and say name equals converters. And of course, that has to be in quotes. It's a string. And then we're going to do the same thing with the CSV viewer, for the viewers, I should say, rather. And we're going to say name equals, and this is going to be called viewers. Okay. So now, if we look at our CLI again, you'll notice that we have converters and viewers. Let's see where we are now. All right, so at this point, we're at step 8, and we need to continue implementing our CLI. We have the groups done. We just need to start adding the commands, and we're just going to stub them out for now. And again, we're going to use the viewers init and the converters CLI. So let's start with the converters CLI. We have a single command that we need to add here. So let's go ahead and add this function called CSV to JSON. We're going to call that the function. Now it's going to take some arguments. For now, I'm going to take no arguments and just pass. So I'm not really doing anything right now, but I'm going to turn that into a command. And as we saw, we use command. Now, I don't want to use CSV to JSON as the name. I just want to set the name to be actually CSV. Okay. And of course, that has to be in quotes. So I've got a command added to converters. Now let's check the CLI quickly again. And let's say that I do CLI converters -- help. And you can see that the converters works, but there are no commands. Well, that's because we need to add this command to the group, to the converters group. So we need to remember to do that. So we're going to say, well, what's the name of the group? Let me hide this. Name of the group is converters group. So converters group, add command, just like we did on the main when we added date and time. So add command, and we're going to add CSV to JSON. We're going to add that. So now if we take a look at this again, if we look at the converters help, you can see that the command now lists out CSV. And of course, I don't have documentation for that CSV because I just did a pass over here. So let's go ahead and put in some documentation, and we'll fill out the rest later. I just want to show you that it will show up. So this is, let's say, my doc string, and we'll split it up this way, like so. So now if I clear this up and I run converters help, you can see that I get CSV, specify an input CSV file to convert to JSON. Okay. And then if I was to do CLI converters CSV -- help, then I will get the full text of the doc string. Okay, so this is the first one we've stubbed out, CSV to JSON. We need to do the same thing now for the viewers. So let's switch to that, and we'll go to the init, because this is where I'm defining my clicks, my CLI interface. So I'm going to have two functions here. One that's going to be called view JSON, and I'll put in the doc string right away. And then we're going to have another function. And by the way, you don't need pass here. Some people do this and put pass. Pass is redundant because this is a statement, right? The doc strings are statements. They're not comments, they're statements. So this satisfies the requirement that the body of my function must have at least one statement. And then we also need the view CSV. So we'll do view CSV. And again, I'm going to copy paste the doc string from the repo. And once more, we need to make sure that we add those to the click group, the viewers group. So first, we need to make those into commands. So click command. And again, I'm going to override the name. I just want it to be called JSON. And then over here, I'm going to do the same thing. But again, I want to override the name, and that's going to be CSV. And then finally, I need to add those commands to the viewers group. So this could be viewers group dot add command, and we're going to add view JSON, and then we're going to do again viewers group add command, and we're going to add view CSV, like so. Okay, so at this point we have everything stubbed out for the commands. If we go ahead and look at our CLI, we have converters and viewers. We can do CLI viewers, and then you can see that basically this is, by the way, this is the same thing as saying CLI viewers -- help, because we don't have a default command. So it's going to default to help. We've got CSV and JSON, and those are the two commands. So let's go back to the README and see where we're at and what the next steps are. So we've stubbed out everything, right? We have our CLI, we have our CLI viewers, our CLI converters. We've got the commands for each one of those. And now it's time to actually implement those commands. So we're going to start with the JSON viewer first. So there's a few things that we want to do. We want an option to specify the JSON file. And that's of course going to be a required thing, right? We can't preview a file that is not provided as a parameter, as an argument on the command line. So that's going to be a required one. But we also want the option to view the entire file or just the first n lines. We also want the option to specify the indentation we want for JSON. And then we'd like to add some help text to explain what the command does, which we have already, but we also want to document what the parameters do, right? So for example, we'll want the ability essentially to issue commands in these possible ways: CLI, viewers, JSON, and then the name of the JSON file. Or maybe we want to say CLI viewers JSON -n10, which means the number of lines, 10 lines, with data sample JSON. Also, or instead of using the short -n, maybe we want to use --num lines and then provide 10. So that would be equivalent. Or maybe we may want to add something like a -i3 to say we want to set the indentation to 3. Or we want to use the long version, --indent 3. So basically we want to specify the file without having to use a flag. So basically just CLI viewers, JSON, and then the data itself. Or we want to be able to add flags like -n or --num lines, -i or --indent, and so on. And then we want to default things. So if you do not specify num lines, it will show everything. If you don't specify an indent, the default should be 4. Now, if you look at the JSON viewer, the default in the function is 2. So this is just going to show that we're going to override what that default is on the CLI. The function itself has a default of 2, but the CLI is going to set that indentation to 4 if we don't specify it on the command line. And of course, for both of these options, we're going to want to validate, and by both options I mean the -n and -i, that the values are integers, right, and that they're in the proper range. So we'll use a none value, let's say, for num lines to indicate no limit, right? But we should validate the value, therefore, as either none, not it doesn't exist, or it's got to be greater than 0. You can't view a negative or a 0 number of lines. There's no point. And then for indent, we're going to want to validate the value, let's say, to be greater than 0. Technically, the function could allow 0 as well, so we could set our validation to be greater than or equal to 0. Up to you how you want to do it. So let's go ahead and implement that. And you're going to see it's really, really straightforward. So we're going to go back to our init, because this is where we're defining those things. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is basically we're going to need some parameters for view.json. We're going to need the file name at the very least, right? And then we're going to need the number of lines, and we're going to need the indent, like so. So this is already a command, but what we need to do now is we need to add things. So if you look at the command line for this view.json, the file name didn't have a name to it, right? It wasn't named. If you think of Python named arguments versus positional arguments, the file name is a positional argument on the command line. Those are called arguments in CLIC. Named variables, named arguments, on the other hand, are called options in CLIC. And so we have two decorators that we're going to use, one called argument for these positional arguments and one called option for these named arguments. So let's go ahead and create the positional argument first for file name. So that's going to be click.argument, and we're going to basically specify the name that we want. So it's going to be file_name. So that's going to be the name assigned to the argument, and that's how it's going to get mapped to file name over here. But we have a few more things we can specify here, and this is where click is also very handy for validation. We want to make sure that whatever file name has been specified actually exists. We could do that in our Python code, but click provides us that functionality already, and it's by using the type argument. So the type is going to be a click.path, so it's going to first of all validate that it's a path, and then we have exists equals true. So this is saying that this needs to be, this file name that you're providing needs to be a valid path, right? A valid path with file name. It needs to exist, and it cannot be a directory. So directory OK is equal to false. So this is saying that do not accept a directory path. It has to be an actual file. You'll notice there's a lot of work going on here that we get for free with click. So let me go ahead and just comment out the rest of this line just so we can test this out. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say echo or click.echo, and I'm going to echo the file name. So now let's test this out. So CLI viewers JSON. Now, of course, if we don't pass the file name, that is a requirement right now, right? And it tells us, hey, you're missing the argument file name. Now, it's an argument, not an option, right? If you look at the usage, it says CLI viewers JSON options followed by a positional argument that's called file name because it kind of uses this name that we have over here. So let's go ahead and give it that. So we can say, well, it's starting from the current directory, go to the data folder, and go ahead and grab sample.json, right? That's the file. So when I do that, you can see that now it validated it, and it said, yeah, okay, and then it went ahead and just did the echo. Now, if I passed in data without giving it an actual file, again, I would get an invalid value for the file name because that is a directory, and we specifically said we do not allow directories here because we need a file. Okay, great. So now let's continue. So now I'm going to uncomment this again. The next thing that we want to add is, let's say, the num lines. So again, we just stack the decorators. Just always put your command at the top. Now let's go ahead with the next decorator. And this one is called an option because this is a named argument. And I'm going to write this over multiple lines. So the first thing is we're going to give it the long name that we want for that flag. So that one's going to be called numLines. And you have to use a double dash. And then for the single dash version, we can just specify it this way. Again, we just have another string with just the single dash. The order in which you specify these things doesn't matter. We are going to specify now that this is not a required field, that it's optional, and we do that by specifying a default. And we're going to say the default is none. So if the person calling our command line doesn't provide --numlines or -n with a value, then numlines over here is going to get set to none. That's what this does. And then the next thing I want to do is I want to validate this. Now again, we could do the validation in here. You can raise an exception, like a click-based exception, to basically report back to the user saying, you did something wrong. But here, we can just use the built-in validation of click by using, again, type. And here we're going to say click.int range. So they were saying that this is an integer range, and it needs to be an integer range 1. What this means is that it needs to be 1 or greater. You can look at the documentation for int range, but when you just specify a single value here, it's saying it needs to be greater than or equal to that value. And that's all we need for that. And then I also want to add help, text help for this particular option. So you do that by specifying the help argument. And I'm just going to copy this from the repo, so I don't have to retype all this stuff out. Okay, so the number of lines of the JSON object to display, set to 0 or omit to view the entire file. So I'm actually lying here. It should just be omit to view the entire file. Otherwise, you could set it to 0 this way, right? So this means that 0 is acceptable. So let's keep it though this way. Set in range to 1 and then just omit it to view the entire file. So I don't want somebody to pass in 0, right? We'll do it this way. And that's our option. That's it. So now we're going to click echo with file name, and we'll go ahead and click echo the num lines, just so we can play around with the command line and make sure that everything's coming out okay, and then click .echo the indent. All right, let's go back to our terminal window and let's go ahead and try this out. So CLI viewers JSON, I'm going to specify the file that, and let's see what we get. So we're missing one required positional argument indent. What did I do? Oh, I forgot to define the indent as well. Sorry about that. Okay, let's go back. We're not done. We have to add indent as well. So it complained because now I've specified that indent is here, and of course that is now a mandatory parameter because I haven't got anything here setting a default. So again, we're going to do click.option. And again, I'm going to do this over multiple lines. And we're going to do -i. So I'm just doing it in the reverse order that I did it here. Usually I keep things ordered consistently. I just want to show you that the order doesn't matter. It basically looks at the dash or dash dash and it can figure out which is which that way. And so the long name is indent. And then we're going to specify a default. So I want my default now to be 4. Remember I said I wanted to default 4? Well, that's how you do it. You just say the default indent is 4. And now I want to go ahead and do the validation. So for that, again, we're going to do an int range. And again, you could use 0 or 1. So you could allow 0, for example, for the indent, which means that there will be no indentation. So we'll do that. And then we're just going to look at the help. And then for help, again, I'm just going to copy that over from the repo, like so. So specifies the indentation level for viewing the JSON object, and 0 will be acceptable. Okay, now let's go back to our terminal window. I do that, and let's take a look. So as you can see, we get the file name, we get none, that's what this is actually over here, is none, and then 4. So that's working properly. We can go ahead and say that, and then we can say maybe -i 10 and -n 50, right? And so you can see here that basically the n, the num lines was picked up as 50, the 10 was picked up for the indentation. We can go ahead and specify no indentation, let's say. And if we run this, you can see our indentation defaulted to 4. We also could pass it after the positional too, if we want that. So we could do that. It works just fine. So you can see this is a lot more powerful than argparse, much easier. It's not that it's more powerful. You can do all this with argparse, but not this easily. Okay, so now that we have the CLI essentially implemented for the JSON viewer, let's go and actually implement the function. Now we have the data already. So let me go back to the function. And we're going to take all this out. And all we need to do is, if you look at the preview for the JSON, with preview JSON, we can pass in the file name, the first n, and the indent. And then everything gets taken care of. It's going to return a string, essentially, and then we can echo that string out. So let's go back to here. And so we're going to, first of all, we're going to need to import this. So we're going to import from viewers.json viewer, we're going to import preview JSON. And then in the function itself, we're going to say result equals preview JSON, and we're going to pass it the file name. We're going to pass it the number of lines, and we're going to pass it the indent. And then we are going to, oh, sorry, I'm doing this in the wrong function. We're doing it under view JSON. And then we're just going to click echo the result, like so. Okay, let's switch back to here and let's go ahead and do some of the other ones. So click viewers, that one. So let's view the full file, right? And there you go. It picked up the file that was in sample.json. Now, even if I were to mess this up, right? Even if I was to do things like this and kind of mess it up, save that. If I rerun this, actually, let me clear and then rerun, and then you'll see that it actually redid the formatting properly, okay? So I'm gonna undo those changes. But you have that. So now we can go ahead and do the same thing and say, yeah, but I want to see my indentation. I want to set my indentation to 0. And you see now you get this in a much more compact form. Or maybe I want to set my indentation to 10, right? And you get that. I am not very readable. You can also say, I'm going to keep the indentation at, whatever the default is, but I want to see, let's say, the first 20 lines of this file, right? And so it does the formatting and then it just chops off 20 lines in there. And so we just get this over here. Now, of course, you can specify, as we saw, you can use the long name. So num lines, and then for that, there would be a dash dash num lines. It works the same way. Okay, let's go back to our preview, README, I should say. And let's see where we're at. So we've implemented step 9. Now we need to implement step 10, which is the CSV viewer. This has a few more options. It has, just like before, a positional argument for the file name. It has the num lines just as before. But then we're going to have a flag. A flag is basically something you specify on the command line that doesn't have a value associated with it. You just specify it or you don't specify it. And the flag should be has header. And we're only going to have the long form for has header. And it will indicate whether the CSV file has a header row or not, because we're going to want to use that when we tabulate the data using our tabulate library. And then we're also going to want to optionally specify the format that we want, the style that we want for the tabulation, either using dash dash format or dash F, and then it will default to fancy outline. If you haven't seen the tabulate video, it's in the YouTube channel. So let's go ahead and implement that. That's again going to be very, very straightforward. So again, I'm in the viewers and I've been keeping all my code in here, right? So my command for viewing CSV is in the same file. So let's go ahead and implement that. So again, we're going to need the file name. So I might as well just take it from here, right? We have that already. So I'm going to take that and I'm going to use that for my CSV as well. It's no different. Then I have this has headers flag. So that is not a positional variable. It is therefore a named variable. It's also an option, in the click terminology. So we're going to say click option, and it's going to be called dash dash has headers. And what's the name that I'm going to want to provide in here in the function? So first of all, I'm going to have file name, and I'm going to return this as just has headers. So I'm going to keep the same name. So that name then corresponds to this variable over here. Okay. And here I have one extra thing I have to do that we haven't seen before, which is flag. And is flag is underscore flag is going to be equal to true. This is to indicate that this is a named argument that goes on the command line, but it doesn't have a value that you put with it. You'll see when we call the command line. Then we're going to specify a default. We'll say the default is false. So if you don't say that this has headers, we'll assume that the CSV file does not have headers. And then lastly, we're going to again specify the help. And again, I'm just going to copy that from the code. And that's our has headers. So that's that one. Now we need num lines and format just as before. So I'm going to go ahead and just type it out, because click dot option. So again, this is an option, it's called dash dash numLines, or it's going to be called dash n, and it's going to go to the variable in my CSV file called, now here before I had it called numLines, right? Which was this over here. It basically defaulted to using numLines. But here what I want is I want to override that. So I don't want numLines here. Let's say I want it to be called something else, right? And so this is the only reason I'm doing that here, is to show you that I want this argument to be line count. So all I need to go and do here is just say line count. There's no dash or dash dash in front of it. So Click will understand that, okay, it means that this option is going to map to the line count, underscore count, in the function name when I call it, okay? And then we're going to also just do the type range as before. So let me just copy that from the code. So we're going to say you need at least one, and then this is the number of rows to display, excluding the header row, if any, okay? And then we have the format, which is what we're going to use to specify the style that we want to display the CSV file in. So for that, again, it's going to be an option, and it's going to be called dash dash format, or just dash F. And here I'm going to want to map to format. Now, I can't really use format. That's a reserved word. That's a built-in thing. So I'm going to call it format underscore, which is what we usually use in Python when we really, really want to use a built-in name. We just basically suffix it with underscore, which means now that I have no choice here. I have to specify it this way. Or I have a choice, I guess. I could name this something totally different, but then I would have to change what this is as well, right? And I don't want that. Okay, and the default, we're going to specify a default value. So default is going to be equal to, now we have that enumeration that I mentioned before, this one over here, the table format. So let's go ahead and import that. So from viewers.enums, import, and then we're going to import table format. All right, so technically I should be putting this line, this import, before this import over here. It's in the wrong order. However, I usually don't worry about that too much because I end up using isort. So here I'm going to use make standardize. And once that's finished running, okay, it failed because there's a syntax error in my init because I haven't finished writing it, but the isort may not have worked. So let me go ahead and clean this up over here because I don't have that default specified, right? So let me go ahead, sorry, and go back here. Let's go ahead and run make standardize. Okay, everything's been reformatted. Now, if I look, you can see that it moved my enums back up here. So I'm good. And that's why I don't worry about it too much when I'm writing code. All right, so we have this import done. We've imported the enum. So now we can say our default is equal to table format, and then we're just going to specify fancy outline. Okay, this is what I want. But this is going to be a string over here. I want this to come back as a string, and so I'm not going to use the fancy outline enum member. I'm going to use its name, okay? And there's different ways you can do this. This is just one way that I picked of doing it. Now, what I want to do as well is that, because remember, okay, this format here is going to come back as a string, right? Because that's what's coming back from the command line. However, Click has a way for us to validate that that string matches something in an enum. And so for this, we're going to say type equals click.choice. And so it doesn't use an enum directly. What you do is you specify, A, B, C, and, D, E, F, and you just say, okay, these are the possible choices, and you have to put them in a list, essentially like this. And then you also have the option of saying that it's not case sensitive. So you could say case sensitive equals false or equals true. In this case, I'm going to set it to true. Now, of course, this isn't my choices. My choices are what? My choices are the names that are in this table format enum. So I'm going to go ahead and use that. So I'm going to use a list comprehension. and I'm going to take the element's name for every element in table format, like so. So those are going to be my choices. And then I also need to specify the help. So if I do not specify the correct choice on the command line, when that's not going to be in this list, right, of the names, then it's going to come back and say, something's wrong, okay? So let me just put in the help for this. Okay. So now we have file name, has headers, line count, and format. We've got all this coming back now from the CLI. And all we need to do is actually implement this. Now, format's going to come back as a string. But if we look at the CSV viewer, it expects the table format to be what? To be of the table format type, right? To be a member of that enum. But that's very easy to do because at this point, we're guaranteed that the name that's getting passed in is valid. So I don't have to put any kind of code to check here. I can just make the assumption that, yep, this is going to be a table format. So I can grab the actual member by passing it the string this way. Okay? That's the first thing. And then the next thing is I'm going to call preview CSV. What does preview CSV take? The first name, first n, whether it has a header row, and the table format. That's exactly what we picked up from the CLI. Note again, this function can be used anywhere else in my code. I may have a REST API that uses that and then generates this, preview CSV and then sends that back. It's got nothing to do with the CLI, but I'm building a CLI on top of my application that also accesses this preview function. So let's go ahead and actually call it. And that's very simple. We can just say result, because remember, that's going to bring back a string, is equal to preview CSV, and then we're going to give it the file name equals file name. There's a few more arguments here, so I'm going to want to name them, and VS Code is telling me that it doesn't know what that is. Well, that's because I haven't imported it. So let's go ahead and put it in the right location. So from viewers.csv viewer, I'm going to import preview CSV. Okay. So now that we have that import done, then this works correctly. And I need to specify a few things. I need to specify the file name, the first n, which is going to be equal to what? My line count. And I don't have to worry about, the line count is either going to be none, right? If I don't specify anything. And actually I am missing that. So let's go ahead and add that in. The default, let's say, equals none. If we look at the preview, right, that the first n can be none. So we accept that. So we'll accept it on the command line as well. Basically, if you don't specify it, then there will be a default. So we know that that's right. Has headers is going to come back from the flag. And so we're going to get a true or false. So that's going to be that. So let's go ahead and specify has header. And that's equal to has headers, because that's the name that we're passing it into as into the function. And then finally, we need the table format. So the table format is equal to that format. And I'm going to use an underscore here. We do not want to shadow the built-ins, okay? And then what do we want to do with that result? We're going to click echo it. So we're going to click echo result. So this is our viewer implemented. Let's go ahead and just try it out. Let me clear that. And let's go ahead and say CLI viewers. Let's make sure that's correct. Yeah, so CLI viewers, we want CSV. Let me clear that, CSV, and then we're going to want to take the file that's in data, and it is called population.csv. This file, there's a link in the README file in the repo that tells you where I obtained the data. It was from the World Bank. I kind of massaged the data a little bit to remove some of the columns. I didn't want to mess things up too much and have a very, very wide CSV file. But anyways, it's good enough for our test purposes here. So I'm going to want to just use that. Let's see what the defaults give us. Okay, so let's take a look first of all at the bugs. Preview.csv got an unexpected keyword argument called has header. And so it's most likely because preview.csv has header row. So let me go ahead and do that. Has header row. Let's try this again. And there we go. That worked. So as you can see, we have now our entire table. Now you'll notice though that country name, those headers didn't show up as headers, and that's because we didn't tell the CLI that, yeah, this file has headers. So let's go ahead and do that. How do we do that? Well, we have a flag. Remember that flag that we defined? So if we look at the definition here, so we have has headers, which is just a flag. So we need to specify it this way, dash dash has dash headers. And let me change this to a dash. Okay, I know we could use an underscore. I don't like that though. Okay, so if we do that, then we should see this formatting now take that into account. And I guess it's a little, it's kind of overflowing, right? So if I made this a little smaller, like so if I make my preview here, my VS Code a little smaller, you can see everything actually fits correctly. And you can see that by default, we're getting that fancy outline. Now we can try other things as well. So let's go ahead and clear that. And let's say that it has headers and I want to see the first 10 row. Now how do I do that? I can either do a dash n or a dash dash num lines. So dash dash num lines, and let's say I want to see the first 20 rows. So if we do that again, we get just the first 20 rows of the file. We can also change the format. So if we go ahead and say dash dash format, so actually before we do that, let's do dash dash help. So if we look at the help, as you can see, it's giving us a list of the formats that are possible, right? That's because we provided that using that choice function to click. So let's say that I'm going to use Markdown. I'm going to use GitHub Markdown, right? So it's just GitHub. It's this over here. So I'm going to go back to here and I'm going to say dash dash format GitHub. And you see that work properly. Now I have GitHub formatted Markdown. If I provided a style that doesn't exist, let's say GitHub 2, then I'm going to get an exception from the CLI, and I'm going to get a nice error that's going to tell me it's an invalid value for this. It should be one of these, okay? Just like you would see with a regular CLI somewhere. Okay, so that was the CSV viewer. All right, so let's take a look at where we're at. We're essentially at step 11, right? We just finished implementing the viewer CLI. So now let's switch to the converter CLI. Now this is going to be a little bit different. Most of the stuff we've seen before, but here we're going to need to specify an input file and an output file. Then we'll need to specify a flag to indicate if the CSV file has headers or not. And this is really the new one here. We also want an option to specify a custom set of column headers, right? So this is an example of a multi-valued option. Now in practice, this may be too tedious to use. You may use a different approach where you could maybe specify a file that has a list, one row for each column in your CSV file that you're overriding, whose headers you're overriding or which don't have headers. That might be a little bit more practical. But here I want to show you how to do a multi-valued option. So let's go ahead and implement that. We decided to implement in the CLI.py file. And let's go ahead and do that. So we already have the thing stubbed out. Now we need to start adding the parameters that we're going to need. Which ones are they? Well, if we take a look, this is the function we're going to call. Convert CSV to JSON. It takes 4 arguments. The CSV file name, the out file name. CSV file name needs to be a CSV file. We're not going to check that it's a CSV file. It will fail if it's not. But we need to at least check that the file exists. Then we need an out file name. For this, we want to make sure that a file name has been specified, but it doesn't need to exist, right? Very often, you're going to create a new file when you're converting your file. We're going to write out to a new file. If it exists, we'll override it. If it's not, we'll create the file and write to it. And then we have the has headers and the custom headers. The has headers indicates that this CSV file has headers or not. And then the custom headers is if you want to override or provide for CSV files that don't have headers, the custom headers. So if you look at this code, it basically checks and says, well, if you don't provide headers and you don't provide custom headers, there's a problem because we need headers in order to create the JSON output, because the headers are going to become the keys in the dictionary. So we'll get a value error. So keep that in mind when we test our CLI. When we see this value error, that's why that's happening. All right, let's actually go now and do the implementation. So we need our input file, and I'm going to copy that directly from the repo because we've seen this before. There's nothing new. So we have an in file. So now I'm using, though, an option, right? Before, for the file, I was using that as a positional argument. This now is going to be an option. It's going to be -- in file or -i. And the argument name in our function is going to be mapped to CSV file name. So I'll fill that in here. And then here, the path, again, we're using click path. We're going to insist that that file must exist and it cannot be a directory. It must be a file. And then just the help for that. The next one is going to be the out file. So let me go ahead and copy paste this. And we're going to call this out file. And this is going to be O for that. And we're going to call this out file name. So that will map to out file name over here. Now here's where we're going to be a little more careful. Does the file need to exist? No. Is a directory okay? No, we also want it to be a file name. It doesn't have to exist, but it has to be a file name. The other thing too that we have the option with in click is to use this writable argument. And basically we can tell it that, hey, whatever the user provides in the CLI command for this out file parameter, make sure that it's writable as well, that that location is writable by the program that's running right now. And so that's going to be out file name. Then we have the headers. So again, I'm just going to copy paste that because we've seen this before. So it's going to be a flag. It's called has headers. The default is going to be false. Will indicate that by default CSV files do not have header rows. And so let's now add our last option, which is going to be the columns. So again, click dot option, and it's going to be called -- columns. Or if you want the short version, we'll allow that. That's going to be a -c. We're going to map this to a variable, to an argument in our function called custom headers. Let me put that right away in there before I forget about it. So here's custom headers. The default is going to be none. So we'll accept nothing for that. So you don't have to specify custom headers. And however, we're going to do this multiple. And multiple is what basically says the user can provide multiple values for this option. So we'll say multiple true. Then we're going to do a type check on it, but the type check is going to be really pretty straightforward. Just says it's a string. That's it. That's all you need. That's all click is going to validate. And then we can specify the help. Again, I'm just going to copy that. All right, another thing I want to do here is maybe change this help a little bit, because I want to indicate to people that if you do not have headers, which is the default, then you must specify custom headers. So if desired, you can provide custom column names using the headers. That's actually wrong. Let's change that using the columns option. So you can provide custom column names using the columns option. Note that note that if you do not specify custom headers, then you must indicate, or you must use the has headers flag. Just something to tell the person looking at the CLI that if you don't specify custom headers using, we can even say using columns, then you must use the has headers flag, like so. Okay, so just a little bit better help, basically. All right, so now that we have this, we just need to call our function. We already have the function written. It's called convert CSV to JSON. And if we haven't imported it, we need to include it here. I already imported it, so that's good. So we can use that function now. And so we're going to call convert CSV to JSON. And I'm going to use named parameters simply so I don't get the order wrong. So CSV file name equals CSV file name. The out file name is equal to the out file name that we have here. Then we have the has headers. That's equal to has headers. I like keeping my variable names the same as the arguments that I'm going to use when I call the function. And then custom headers equals custom headers. So that's why I did that, and that's why I renamed those things that way, right? Okay, because this name here is invisible to the user of our CLI. They just see columns and C. They don't see this internal name. Okay, so now let's check this out and see if it works. If we did everything correctly, it should work fine. So let's get a terminal, and we're going to do CLI. And CLI has this group called converters, right? So you can see it has one command called CSV. So we're going to clear this and CSV. And if I look at the help, I can do help this way, or I can just omit that altogether. You can see, if I make this a little bit bigger, we have the help information, specify and input that, note, that note about having to use the has headers flag. And then we have the various parameters or options for this command with the help for each one of those. So let's go ahead and use it. So we'll do that. Now we're going to specify an in file, and we do that using the -i. And we're going to use data, we're going to use that population, right? .csv. And I need an out file. And for the out file, I'm going to use the same location, and I'm just going to call it test1.json. Now, if I try and run this, this isn't going to work. Remember that we're going to get this value error. Headers must be provided if CSV does not contain them. You could basically do this error higher up and do that in your actual CLI itself if you wanted to. So you could do it in here, because now you're getting outside the realm of whatever the default kind of validators that Click has. You can write custom validators, but you can also just do it here, and then you could raise basically a different type of exception, a Click exception basically. So you could do that. I'm just going to leave it as is. If you want, if you're interested in that, go read the documentation. Okay, so now we know that we have to use that has headers, right? So let's go ahead and let me clear that, and I'm going to specify has headers. I'm going to say, yeah, it has headers. And you can see that ran correctly, and now we have this file, test1.json. See, it's not pretty formatted. So that's okay though, because we have a viewer. So I can basically go and say CLI viewers, and we're going to view a JSON file, and our file is data, so .data / test1.json. And in fact, I'm only going to look, let's say, at the first 10 rows in there. And you can see this is how we have the formatting now as well. And you can see with the file, the column names, right, became the keys of the dictionary. Okay, so now let's go ahead and use the columns option. And we only have 4 columns. That's one of the reasons why I modified the data from the World Bank. So let's clear that up. And that's not the one I want. This is the one that I want. Now, technically, I do not have to specify has headers because I'm going to provide the columns, but my file still has the headers, and I don't want that ending up in the, as a data row, essentially. So I'm going to keep that flag indicating that this file has headers, but I'm going to add columns. So let me do a next line here, and I'm going to specify the long name using columns. So the way that we have to specify the columns, we have to re-specify the flag multiple times. That's why I was saying it's going to get a little tedious. So let's go ahead and say that the first one is country. Now here forward, I'm just going to use the abbreviated version. So country, code. Then we're going to specify, let's say, Y 2020 and Y 2021. I think it was 2020 and 2021. Let's just check that. 2020, 2021. Yeah, okay. So that should work. And I'm also going to write to test 2 like this. So we've got the, we're not overriding test 1. And so you can see that it created the file test21 because I forgot to delete 1. So it's called test21 JSON. And if we look at that file, You can see that it's got the JSON data. You can see that it actually skipped the header in my CSV file. That was in my CSV file because I set that it had headers. If I hadn't done that, if I hadn't specified that, then I would actually see the headers in my CSV file as a row in the JSON. So that's why I wanted to specify both. So I wanted to do has headers. And of course, now we can view this if we want to instead. So we can say CLI viewers JSON and then data / test 21.json. And then we'll just look at the first, let's say 10 lines in there. Okay. And you can see it's properly formatted and everything. All right, so this was a fairly lengthy video, but if you think about it, we really wrote a pretty sophisticated CLI, and it was really, really easy to do so. So I hope you use Click the next time you want to actually write a CLI in Python that sits on top of your project. So thank you for watching.